There are rivalries that define communities, feuds so old nobody remembers how they started, but everyone knows which side they're on. In Harper County, Kansas, that rivalry was between two men, two dealerships, and two colors of iron that represented more than machinery. On the north side of town sat Garrison Implement, a Massey Ferguson dealership that had been selling red tractors since 1959. On the south side, 12 miles down Highway 54, sat Kerrigan Farm Equipment, a John Deere operation that had been green since before most farmers in the county were born. The owners, Ed Garrison and Michael Kerrigan, had competed for 40 years, stolen each other's customers, undercut each other's prices, and maintained a public rivalry that was part business and part theater. Everyone in Harper County knew the story. If you bought Massey Ferguson, you didn't talk to Kerrigan. If you ran Deere, you didn't set foot in Garrison's showroom. The lines were drawn, the loyalty was real. And the two men who ran those dealerships hated each other with the kind of competitive fire that made farming equipment into something personal. Except they didn't. Not really. Because for 25 years, from 1997 until Ed Garrison died in 2022, those two dealers had been secretly trading parts after hours, sharing inventory across brand lines, and keeping each other's customers running during breakdowns that could have cost harvest days and destroyed seasons. Nobody knew. Not the customers, not the families, not even most of the staff. The rivalry everyone saw was real, but underneath it was a partnership built on something deeper than brand loyalty, the understanding that keeping farmers in the field mattered more than the color of the machine. This is the story of two men who performed competition for their community while cooperating in the dark, a secret that stayed buried until one of them died and his son found the ledgers, and the revelation that changed how an entire county understood what it meant to be rivals. Ed Garrison and Michael Kerrigan had built their reputations on hating each other. What they'd actually built was a system to make sure no farmer in Harper County ever lost a day because two dealers were too proud to help each other. The rivalry was the show, the partnership was the truth. And when the secret came out, it forced every farmer who'd chosen a side to reconsider what loyalty actually meant when the men they'd been loyal to had been working together all along. Ed Garrison had inherited his Massey Ferguson dealership from his father in 1982, taking over an operation that had been serving Harper County since the Eisenhower administration. Ed's father, Frank Garrison, had started selling Massey Ferguson tractors when they were still called Massey Harris, back when a handshake meant more than a contract, and dealers were neighbors first and businessmen second. Frank had raised Ed in that tradition, teaching him that a dealership's reputation was built on being available when things broke, not just when farmers were buying. Ed learned to wrench before he learned to sell, spent his teenage years in the service bay pulling transmissions and rebuilding hydraulics. And by the time he took over the business, he understood something fundamental. Farmers didn't care about your profit margin when their combine was down during harvest. They cared whether you'd show up at midnight with the part they needed. Ed built Garrison Implement on that principle. He kept deep inventory. He maintained relationships with every Massey Ferguson farmer in 3 counties, and he competed ruthlessly against anyone who threatened his market share. Michael Kerrigan had come up the same way, inheriting Kerrigan Farm Equipment from his father in 1985. The Kerrigan family had been John Deere people since the 1940s, 3 generations of dealers who'd built their business on the Deere reputation for durability and a service network that stretched across the Midwest. Michael's father had taught him the same lessons Ed's father had taught Ed. Be available, keep parts in stock, and never let a farmer sit idle because you didn't want to work late. Michael had grown up in the Deere culture, believed in the engineering, and ran his dealership with the same principles Ed ran his. The difference was the color. Massey Ferguson red versus John Deere green. In Harper County, that difference mattered. Farmers chose sides. Families had brand loyalties that went back generations. And the 2 dealerships that served them fed that loyalty by competing publicly, visibly, and sometimes viciously. The rivalry had started before either Ed or Michael took over, something their fathers had begun in the 1960s, when the agriculture equipment market in Kansas was booming and every dealer was fighting for market share. By the time Ed and Michael inherited their businesses, the competition was baked into the community's identity. Garrison Implement ran ads in the local paper highlighting Massey Ferguson's horsepower advantages. Kerrigan Farm Equipment responded with ads about Deere's resale value. If Ed sponsored the county fair, Michael sponsored the 4-H livestock show. If Michael offered 0% financing, Ed matched it the next week. Farmers loved it. The competition kept prices reasonable and service sharp. Ed and Michael played their roles perfectly, never acknowledging each other in public, maintaining a cold distance that everyone interpreted as genuine animosity. At the Farm Bureau meetings, they sat on opposite sides of the room. At the co-op, they didn't speak. The rivalry was so well established that when a farmer bought from one dealer, the other dealer wouldn't even bid on future business from that customer. You were Garrison's customer or Kerrigan's customer, but never both. What nobody knew was that the rivalry had limits, boundaries that Ed and Michael had quietly established in 1997 after an incident that forced them both to reconsider what they were actually fighting for. That spring, a farmer named Dale Hutchins, one of Ed's longtime Massey Ferguson customers, had a hydraulic pump fail on his 3680 tractor in the middle of May planting. Ed didn't have the part in stock. The nearest Massey Ferguson dealer with inventory was 3 hours away, and getting the part shipped would take 2 days. Dale was facing a 48-hour delay during a narrow planting window, weather forecasts showing rain moving in that would shut him down for a week. Ed called every Massey Ferguson dealer within 200 miles. Nobody had the pump available for immediate pickup. Dale was going to lose his window. Ed sat in his office that evening, staring at the phone, knowing his customer was dead in the water and there was nothing he could do. Then he did something he'd never done before. He called Michael Kerrigan. Michael answered on the third ring, probably expecting a supplier or a customer. When he heard Ed's voice, there was a long pause. The two men had never called each other. They'd never had a conversation outside of county meetings where silence was maintained out of principle. Ed explained the situation, kept it short and factual. He had a customer down. He needed a hydraulic pump that fit a Massey Ferguson 3680. He knew it was a long shot, but some hydraulic components were cross-compatible between brands, and if Michael happened to have anything in his John Deere inventory that would work, Ed would pay cash, pick it up that night, and nobody needed to know the transaction happened. Michael was quiet for a moment. Then he said something Ed never expected. "I've got a pump that'll work. Come by after we close." Ed drove to Kerrigan Farm Equipment at 9 p.m., parked in the back lot, and knocked on the service bay door. Michael let him in, handed him the pump, and refused payment. He just said one thing: "Next time I need something, we're even." Ed installed the pump that night. Dale Hutchins was planting by sunrise, and a partnership that would last 25 years started with a handshake in a dark service bay between two men who were supposed to be enemies. After that night, Ed and Michael developed a system. They never talked about it. They never formalized it. But when one of them had a customer down and couldn't source a part fast enough, they'd call each other after hours. If the part was cross-compatible or could be modified to work, they'd make it available. They kept separate ledgers, documented every transaction, and settled accounts quarterly in cash, so there was no paper trail that suppliers or manufacturers could track. The transactions were small. A bearing here, a hydraulic line there, filters, sensors, electrical components that weren't brand specific. But the impact was massive. Farmers in Harper County, whether they ran Massey Ferguson or John Deere, started experiencing something unusual. When something broke during critical times, their dealer had a solution faster than should have been possible. Ed's customers didn't know their parts sometimes came from Kerrigan's inventory. Michael's customers didn't know Michael was calling Ed when he was out of stock. The two dealerships maintained their public rivalry, kept competing on sales and advertising, but behind the scenes they were cooperating to make sure no farmer in their county lost time because of parts availability. The partnership expanded slowly. By 2000, Ed and Michael had moved beyond emergency parts sharing. They started coordinating on used equipment. If a Massey Ferguson farmer wanted to trade in a Deere tractor, Ed would call Michael, and Michael would come appraise it after hours, giving Ed a fair wholesale number so the farmer got treated right. If a Deere customer wanted to trade in Massey Ferguson equipment, Michael did the same, calling Ed for appraisal. They made sure trade-ins went to the right dealers instead of getting wholesaled out of the county at scrap prices. They referred customers to each other when someone needed equipment the other brand specialized in. If a farmer asked Ed about a piece of John Deere tillage equipment, Ed would quietly suggest they talk to Michael, and vice versa. They weren't betraying their brands. They were serving their county. And the more they cooperated in private, the more exaggerated their public rivalry became, a necessary performance to keep anyone from suspecting what was actually happening. Their families didn't know. Ed's wife thought he and Michael genuinely hated each other. Michael's son, who worked at Kerrigan Farm Equipment and would eventually take over the business, believed the rivalry was personal. The dealership employees on both sides were kept in the dark. Only Ed and Michael knew the full scope of what they were doing, and they kept it that way intentionally. If word got out, the cooperation would stop working. Farmers would feel betrayed, like their brand loyalty had been manipulated. Manufacturers would view it as a violation of dealer agreements, and the community identity that had been built around the Garrison versus Kerrigan rivalry would collapse. So Ed and Michael maintained the fiction. They ignored each other in public. They competed aggressively on sales. They gave interviews to the county newspaper about the importance of brand loyalty and supporting your local dealer. And late at night, when a farmer was down and time mattered more than pride, they called each other and made sure the work got done. The system worked flawlessly for 2 decades. Harper County farmers had some of the lowest equipment downtime in the region, a fact that economic development reports attributed to strong dealer support but never understood the real reason behind. Ed and Michael's dealerships stayed profitable, maintained their customer bases, and survived market downturns that killed smaller operations across Kansas. The rivalry gave both men cover to run their businesses the way they wanted, without the pressure to expand aggressively or consolidate with regional dealer networks. They could stay independent, family-owned, and community-focused because the competition between them was visible enough that neither looked weak for not growing. What looked like a feud was actually a shield, protecting 2 businesses that operated on principles the modern agriculture industry was moving away from. But in 2020, the partnership faced its biggest test. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted supply chains across every industry, and agriculture equipment dealers were hit hard. Parts that used to arrive in days were taking weeks or months. Manufacturers were backlogged. Farmers were facing planting and harvest seasons with equipment they couldn't get repaired because nobody had inventory. Ed and Michael started getting calls from desperate customers, farmers who'd been loyal for decades and were now staring at downtime that could cost them entire seasons. The 2 dealers made a decision. They pooled their parts inventory, not officially, not on paper, but functionally. Garrison Implement and Kerrigan Farm Equipment operated as a single parts department for 18 months, sharing everything they had to keep their customers running. If Ed had a fuel injector a Deere farmer needed, Michael picked it up and installed it. If Michael had an alternator that would work in a Massey Ferguson, Ed got it the same day. They stopped settling accounts quarterly. They stopped keeping separate ledgers. They just helped each other's customers survive, trusting that the balance would work out eventually, because the goal wasn't profit, it was keeping Harper County farming. The farmers noticed something, but couldn't figure out what. During the worst supply chain crisis in modern agriculture history, Harper County had equipment uptime that didn't make sense. Tractors that should have been down for weeks were back in the field in days. Combines that needed parts back-ordered until October were running in September. Farmers started asking their dealers how they were sourcing parts so fast. Ed would shrug and say he'd called in some favors. Michael would say he had good supplier relationships. Nobody pushed harder because the work was getting done. But the truth was simpler and stranger than anyone guessed. The two dealerships that had been rivals for 60 years were functioning as partners, sharing resources across brand lines, because the pandemic had made brand loyalty a luxury nobody could afford. By the time supply chains stabilized in late 2021, Ed and Michael had saved dozens of farming operations from catastrophic delays. They'd also saved each other. The cooperation had kept both dealerships profitable during a period when independent dealers across the country were closing or getting absorbed by corporate networks. Ed and Michael had survived by doing the one thing their public personas said they'd never do: working together. They never talked about what the partnership had become. They never acknowledged that the rivalry had evolved into something closer to friendship. They just kept calling each other when customers needed help, kept sharing resources when it made sense, and kept performing the rivalry in public, because that's what the community expected. Ed Garrison died in March 2022, a heart attack in his sleep at 73 years old. The funeral was massive, farmers from across 3 counties showing up to pay respects to a man who'd kept their equipment running for 4 decades. Michael Kerrigan was there, sitting in the back, not making a scene, just present. People noticed. The rival dealer showing up felt significant, a gesture of respect that suggested maybe the feud hadn't been as bitter as everyone thought. Ed's son, David Garrison, inherited the dealership and spent the weeks after the funeral going through his father's office, trying to understand the full scope of the operation he'd just taken over. David had worked at Garrison Implement for 15 years, knew the business, knew the customers. But when he started going through the filing cabinets in his father's private office, he found something that didn't make sense. There was a separate ledger, handwritten, going back to 1997. It documented parts transactions, dollar amounts, dates, and customer names. But the transactions didn't match Garrison Implement's official inventory records. David spent 2 days trying to figure out what he was looking at before he noticed the pattern. The parts his father had logged weren't Massey Ferguson parts. They were John Deere components. And the financial settlements documented quarterly cash payments to Kerrigan Farm Equipment. David called his mother, asked if she knew anything about his father doing business with Michael Kerrigan. She said that was impossible. Those 2 men hadn't spoken in 40 years except to compete. David knew that wasn't true anymore. He drove to Kerrigan Farm Equipment on a Thursday afternoon, walked into Michael's office, and put the ledger on his desk. He didn't ask a question. He just waited. Michael looked at the ledger, looked at David, and asked if anyone else had seen it. David said no. Michael nodded, then told David to sit down because there was a story he needed to hear. For the next 2 hours, Michael explained the partnership, how it started, why it stayed secret, and what it had meant to both dealerships and the county for 25 years. He showed David his own ledger, the matching records from Kerrigan's side. He explained the system, the after-hours calls, the parts sharing during the pandemic, all of it. David sat there, processing the fact that his father and the man he'd believed his father hated had actually been partners, working together to keep farmers running while maintaining a public rivalry that was part genuine competition and part community theater. When Michael finished, David asked the only question that mattered. Why didn't he tell anyone? Michael's answer was simple: because it worked better when nobody knew. David went home that night and read through the ledger again, this time understanding what he was seeing. His father hadn't just run a dealership. He'd built a system to protect farmers from the limitations of brand loyalty and parts availability. The rivalry with Kerrigan had been real in terms of competition, but it had never been about hate. It had been about 2 men who understood that serving their community mattered more than corporate identity. David realized his father had taught him how to run a dealership, but he'd never taught him the most important part, that sometimes the best way to serve your customers is to work with your competition instead of against them. The ledger was proof that Ed Garrison had been doing that for most of David's life, and David had never known. David made a decision. He called Michael and asked if they could meet. When Michael showed up, David proposed something Michael wasn't expecting. He wanted to formalize the partnership, not publicly, not in a way that would destroy the rivalry or confuse the community, but he wanted to expand what his father and Michael had built, create a real resource-sharing system between the dealerships, and stop pretending they had to operate in secret. Michael listened, then asked what David thought would happen if farmers found out. David said he didn't know, but he thought Harper County was ready to understand that two dealers could compete and cooperate simultaneously. Michael disagreed. He thought the rivalry was part of what made both dealerships successful, that the community needed the simplicity of choosing sides. They argued for an hour, not angrily, but seriously, debating whether the secret should stay buried or if it was time to let people know the truth. The decision got made for them in July 2022. A reporter from a regional agriculture magazine was writing a feature about independent dealerships surviving corporate consolidation, and Harper County's two family-owned operations were part of the story. During interviews, the reporter noticed something strange. Multiple farmers mentioned that both Garrison Implement and Kerrigan Farm Equipment had kept them running during the 2020 supply chain crisis, sometimes with parts that shouldn't have been available. The reporter started asking questions, comparing timelines, and noticed that several farmers had received parts during periods when those parts were nationally backordered. When the reporter asked David how Garrison Implement had managed that, David made a split-second decision. He told the truth. He explained the partnership, showed the reporter the ledgers, and confirmed that his father and Michael Kerrigan had been cooperating for 25 years. The article, when it published in September 2022, was titled "The Rivalry That Wasn't: How Two Kansas Dealers Secretly Saved Their Community." The response was immediate and divided. Some farmers felt betrayed, like their brand loyalty had been manipulated. Others felt relief, like they'd been freed from a false choice. The county coffee shop became a forum for debate about whether Ed and Michael had been heroes or hypocrites. Michael Kerrigan gave one interview, brief and defensive, explaining that the partnership had never been about deceiving anyone. It was about keeping farmers in the field when it mattered most. David gave multiple interviews, defending his father's choices and arguing that the rivalry and the partnership weren't contradictory. They were complementary. Ed and Michael had competed on sales, marketing, and customer service while cooperating on parts availability and emergency support. That wasn't dishonest. It was smart. Over the following months, the controversy settled into something more complex. Farmers started acknowledging that Harper County had better equipment uptime than surrounding areas, that breakdowns during critical seasons had been handled faster than should have been possible, and that both dealerships had stayed independent and family-owned while corporate chains absorbed competitors across Kansas. The rivalry had given both businesses cover to operate with principles that modern agriculture was moving away from: community focus, relationship-based service, and the willingness to prioritize keeping customers farming over maximizing profit. Ed and Michael hadn't been lying about the competition. They just understood that competition didn't have to mean refusing to help each other when farmers needed it. By the end of 2022, something unexpected happened. Farmers in Harper County stopped seeing the dealership choice as binary. Instead of being Garrison customers or Kerrigan customers exclusively, farmers started using both dealerships depending on what they needed. If they ran Massey Ferguson, they bought from Garrison, but knew Kerrigan would support them if Garrison was out of stock. If they ran Deere, they bought from Kerrigan, but trusted Garrison if they needed help. The rivalry didn't disappear. David and Michael still competed on sales. They still ran competing ads. They still sponsored different community events. But the edges softened. Farmers saw them talk at co-op meetings. They saw them coordinate on used equipment appraisals publicly instead of in secret. The community started understanding that rivalry and partnership could coexist, that two businesses could fight for market share while cooperating to serve the same goal. In 2023, another independent dealership in Kansas, a Case IH operation struggling with parts availability, reached out to David and asked how Garrison Implement managed inventory so well. David told them the truth about the partnership with Kerrigan. Within 6 months, 3 independent dealerships in the region had formed a similar informal network, sharing parts across brand lines during emergencies, coordinating on used equipment, and supporting each other through supply chain disruptions. The model Ed and Michael had built in secret was spreading, not as a corporate strategy, but as a grassroots recognition that independent dealers survived by helping each other instead of operating in isolation. Brand loyalty still mattered to farmers, but dealer cooperation was becoming something the industry acknowledged instead of something dealers had to hide. Michael Kerrigan retired in early 2024, handing Kerrigan farm equipment to his son, who'd finally learned the truth about the partnership his father had maintained for decades. At Michael's retirement party, David Garrison gave a speech, public acknowledgement that the two dealerships had been partners as much as rivals, and that Harper County had been better for it. Michael didn't give a long response. He just said that Ed Garrison had been the best competitor and the best partner he'd ever had, and that the secret they'd kept for 25 years was simple. Farmers didn't care what color the tractor was if it kept running, and dealers shouldn't care what brand the part came from if it got the job done. The room applauded, not because the rivalry was over, but because everyone finally understood it had never been what they thought it was. The ledgers that David found in his father's office are now displayed in Garrison Implement's showroom, framed side by side with Michael's matching records from Kerrigan Farm Equipment. They're labeled "The Partnership Nobody Knew About," and farmers stopped to read them. Seeing 25 years of cooperation documented in handwritten entries that proved two men had cared more about keeping their community farming than maintaining a rivalry that was easier to perform than to break. Ed Garrison and Michael Kerrigan had competed publicly and cooperated privately, understanding that both were necessary. The rivalry kept them sharp. The partnership kept farmers running. And the secret they maintained for a quarter century became, once revealed, a model for how independent businesses survive by recognizing that competition doesn't have to mean isolation. Harper County still has a Massey Ferguson dealer and a John Deere dealer, 12 miles apart, competing for customers and market share. The rivalry is real, but so is the partnership. And every farmer in the county knows now that the two dealers who fight hardest for their business are also the two who will call each other at midnight to make sure a breakdown doesn't cost a harvest day. Ed Garrison and Michael Kerrigan built that system in secret because they thought it was the only way it would work. What they actually built was proof that rivalry and respect aren't opposites, that competition can make you better without making you enemies, and that the best way to beat your rival might be making sure you both survive. The dealerships that serve Harper County today still operate on that principle. They compete in daylight and cooperate in the dark, just like their founders did. And the community that once thought it had to choose sides has learned something more valuable. Loyalty matters, but so does the willingness to work together when the work is more important than the brand on the hood.